Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this very special plenary session at this year's Division of Health Psychology Annual Conference. And as you can see, we've got 5 excellent people on the panel who we'll introduce in a second. But the format, just for your information, is that each member of the panel have been tasked to say a couple of words in answer to this question: what's in a name in relation to being a health psychologist? And the whole idea is that we want to spark discussion with members, with you guys sitting here in the audience today. So after each of the 2-minute brief presentations, some will have slides, some will not, then we really want to open it up for discussion. And I'll try and kind of keep the discussion going. When it's drying up, I might be insulting. I will endeavor to do that as frequently as I can. And otherwise, we're hoping to really have a really enjoyable 60 minutes. Note, however, this has been live streamed on YouTube. So if your employer is watching you, be careful what you say, all right? And it will be a legacy event, so it will remain on YouTube afterwards. So we're hoping that also it will spread far and wide and maybe prompt subsequent conversations afterwards. I should say that in the early advertising of this particular event, Claire Hallis was also supposed to be joining the panel today. Claire's unable to be here, but she has sent some questions that we will also feed into the discussion. So Claire, I suspect you're watching on YouTube. Hello. And Margaret will hopefully ask her questions as and when. So let's move over first of all to introduce each of our speakers. So we've got Lucy Byrne-Davis from the University of Manchester. We have Ronan O'Carroll from the University of Stirling. We have Joe Hart from the University of Manchester, Falco Sciata from the University of Newcastle, and we have Vivian Swanson, also from the University of Stirling. And if I didn't say it, I'm Darrell O'Connor from the University of Leeds. Okay, so let's kick things off with Lucy. So Lucy, do you want me to show your slide?
Yeah. So who is older than... Can you hear me? Who is older? Who was born before 1970? Before 1979? If you raise your hands, okay. So who knows the answer to this question, but don't say it out loud? Okay, I know the answer to this question. It's quite rude. I'm not going to say it because of the whole YouTube thing. But the answer is that people didn't want to be known as the Judean People's Front because they were the People's Front of Judea. I'm going to return to that in a minute about the issue of splitters, as they call them in the life of Brian. So I work globally, and that's made me think a lot actually about how I introduce myself and the impact that has. So sometimes I introduce myself as a psychologist, and then there are loads of assumptions that I work with patients on a one-to-one basis, and that I work in mental health, so that's quite difficult. Sometimes I introduce myself as a behavioural scientist. The assumptions then is that I don't practice at all, and that I'm a pointy head who doesn't really know how to do things, but knows how to answer some questions, maybe. But bit of a kind of, well, you could do this, you could do that, but I don't really know, and you'll have to make the decision. So there is definitely an issue around whether you're a psychologist or whether you're a scientist, and how we're then perceived in terms of what we can do and how we're useful and what we do. I would describe myself as a practitioner, and the reason that I would describe myself that way is that I do something that affects something else, and I'm paid to do that. As a researcher, which I also would self-identify as well, I answer some questions, and I'm paid to do that. But as a practitioner, people don't necessarily want an answer to a question. They want me to do something that will have an effect on something else. And in that regard, I would say that I was a practitioner. In DHP, I think being a practitioner means practicing one-to-one with patients. So I've had situations where people have said that I'm not a practitioner, a health psychologist, because I don't do one-to-one work with patients, and I think that's not true. So there we are. You can pick me up on that later. Why any of this matters? I think outside psychology, there are these big assumptions about how we're viewed, how much influence we have. If I'm a pointy head, I don't know the real world. I'm in an ivory tower. I don't make any decisions. If I'm a practitioner, I don't do the science. I'm not up to date with my theory. So there are these kind of assumptions that seem to go around these particular kind of titles. And then inside psychology, forgive me, because maybe I don't know my theory, but I'm going to think about social identity theory a little bit, and that if we create in-groups and out-groups, then we'll start to look for differences, there'll be prejudice, and I think that can happen within psychology itself, that I've heard colleagues say that they can't be sure of a health psychologist's training in the way that they can be sure of their own profession's training. And I think that's because we're an in-group and an out-group. We've created divisions. They're literally called divisions. I mean, how weird is that? And so we're not necessarily identifying with each other. And if we're too busy worrying about splitters, we might not be able to fight the Roman occupation.
Thank you very much for that, Joe. So we've next, Ronan O'Carroll is going to... Sorry, multitasking's failing me today. If Ronan didn't have slides, thanks very much for that, Ronan. Okay. Thanks, Lucy. Okay, so Ronan, would you like your slide?
Well, this proves that we didn't have any contact beforehand, because I went for the Judean People's Front as well. If you go to the next slide, please, because I've often thought about the life of Brian in relation to titles, and this is just, and I apologise if it caused any offence, this is text from it. Are you the Judean People's Front? F off. What? Judean People's Front? We're the People's Front of Judea. Judean People's Front. Can I join your group? Okay. The only people we hate more than the Romans are the Judean People's Front and the Judean Popular People's Front. Yes, splitters. And the People's Front of Judea. Splitters, splitters. The People's Front of Judea, splitters. We're the People's Front of Judea. I thought we were the Popular Front. The People's Front. So it's just a silly spoof about the name and the titles. And I've often thought that outsiders, when they look at psychologists and the different titles, clinical psychologist, health psychologist, clinical health psychologist, counselling psychologist, I just think a lot of outsiders don't care. And that the most important thing is we're psychologists. And just to echo Lucy's point, I think we could present more of a united front, and then have as we present ourselves as psychologists with our strengths and with our specialities that follow that. Just as a personal example, for the past 28 years, I just realised every Tuesday afternoon do a clinic in a general hospital in Edinburgh. And when I started that, I was a clinical psychologist. And then after about 10 years, I became a health psychologist because Mary Johnson told me to do that. And so I've done that for 20 years. I'm a clinical psychologist, I'm a health psychologist. I don't think anybody actually cares there. I think the biggest problem that my medical colleagues have is differentiating between psychiatrists and psychologists, and they're not pretty sure about that. And the more we go into presenting ourselves with our subdivisions, I do think we're doing ourselves a disservice. And I think in many ways, if we could have the united body of the strength of psychology as a discipline in a profession first, I think we'd maybe do better.
Okay, Ronan, thank you very much for that. Joe.
So I'm current chair of the DHP, and I wanted to reflect some of the discussions that we've been having that I think are really related to the types of topics we've been talking about. One point that hasn't come up already is about what we call ourselves in a slightly different way. We notice that when we look at people's signatures, for those in universities and in other places, often people aren't referring to themselves as health psychologists. There's a lot of those kind of behavioural sciences, but behavioural medicine, there's a lot of alternative titles. I myself don't have health psychology in my role title. And that's confusing for people because we do introduce ourselves in very different ways, and I wonder why people have chosen not to call themselves health psychologists in their title. Not everyone has a choice about that, but why people aren't identifying themselves as psychologists or health psychologists, and that is interesting, and what people perceive are the benefits of calling themselves behavioural medicine or behavioural science or one of the other alternatives that we see. So I think that's worth thinking about, because I think that further muddies the waters in terms of who we are and what we can do, and when we make really big achievements, that people don't necessarily associate those achievements with health psychology and the breadth of things that we can do. What's happening in the DHP at the moment is that we're receiving quite a lot of contacts from people who have experience of applying for jobs and being told as a health psychologist that they either aren't eligible to apply or they aren't shortlisted because they're a health psychologist, even though the competencies are very clearly health psychology in part or in whole, and people feel that they have those competencies and are very clear about the divides of their competencies. And we've received quite a large number of examples of job adverts in that situation, and a number of our members are lobbying by sending back letters to each of those jobs that they notice. People have done amazing jobs collating all of the examples that they see. And we don't know exactly why that is, but it's of concern that in the NHS, people aren't aware of health psychology and therefore can't kind of employers or lobby for jobs or think about what we can do. So that's an ongoing concern. There's a slight concern about when people are getting jobs and they're advertised as clinical psychologists, for example, that they are able to call themselves a health psychologist as their protected title if the trust perceives them as a clinical psychologist. So that's a side issue. There was an agreement by the BPS that I'm just going to read a snippet of, because the BPS has had a lot of concerns about this. There was an agreement in 2010 about advertising jobs by competency, not adjectival title, and there was a lot of work went into that. So that part of that agreement specifically said psychologists, managers and leaders are specifically advised that advertisements for psychology posts should seek applicants from applied psychologists who meet the required competencies for the post, where specified essential competencies usually associated with an adjectival title such as clinical, counselling, health, forensic or educational are needed. This must be clearly specified. The specific requirement must be justified and consider issues of equal opportunity in employment laws. Consideration must be given to whether an applicant through CPD and post-qualification experience may have acquired these competencies despite adjectival title and so be eligible for the post. I think that was a really important agreement. I don't think it's being adhered to in the NHS, and I think we've got a large body of work to understand why that is and how we can ensure that we get the jobs that we are competent for and how people understand that. I don't think that's for our division on its own. I think it's a more general issue about applied psychology, but there's something gone wrong there in terms of that, what's in a name, how jobs are being advertised that health psychologists could do, and I think we're not doing well. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Joe. So just before Falco begins, can we just hopefully be thinking of questions in response to these different positions and the different issues that have been raised? So I'm hoping as soon as Vivian finishes her presentation, lots of hands are going to be raised, okay? So preempting you. Falco.
Yes, 3 points. About 10 years ago, I attended a workshop in Ottawa where a range of bigwig people sat around the table and introduced themselves. And they all said that they're professor, doctor, director. And then Derek came in and says, "My name is Derek Johnston. I'm a tourist from Aberdeen," because he was traveling in the region and just came in. And I thought, wow, that's tremendously likable. And usually I try to copy Derek, so for the next 10 years, I tend to introduce myself as Falco from Newcastle. And I appreciate it works for us because we are perhaps white, middle-aged men who look like the type of people you'd listen to. But it's also the case that, of course, these titles, they give people the credits for their expertise and their experience. And not everybody gets the benefit of getting into a room looking as wise as Derek does and being able to just talk and people will listen to him. And I think it's important to see that by using those titles consistently, we also enable other people to draw on the credits and on the expertise that comes in association with this title. I'm Falco from Newcastle, but I'm also perhaps the token foreigner on this panel. No offense, Daryl. And I think one of the reasons that I have been invited is that my education was not done in English-speaking country, so it was really quite difficult, next to impossible for me to become a fully chartered member of the BPS. So I'm neither of these things. I'm not a BPS member, I'm not a chartered health psychologist, and legally I'm not allowed to call myself a health psychologist. So as we're on YouTube, I would like to give the British Psychological Society the opportunity to sue me for saying, I am a health psychologist. And I'm quite proud to be one. And I appreciate I haven't done the BPS MSc, and you haven't accredited me, and the Health Professional Council hasn't got me on their books. And I would probably not offer my practice services in a hospital either, because that couldn't be very safe. But I'm still a psychologist, and so if we use those titles to give people the opportunity to say what they can do, we need to make sure that it's fair, and that doesn't exclude people based on the origin in which they have had their education, or whether or not they happen to have the MSc that was accredited by the BPS at the time, if overall they have the competencies to do this work. And finally, perhaps the last point, in the post-truth era, there are many people who have PhDs, who are accredited psychologists, and who sell us nonsense. They sell us nonsense scientifically, they sell nonsense in practice, and I think we need to be aware of the fact that the titles will only ever go so far in making sure that what you can expect from somebody is kosher and is in line with best evidence and best practice. So the whole agenda of transparent open science is really important. It's really important that we continuously communicate the evidence that there is transparently with the public, so that people have additional safeguards to make sure that when they listen to a health psychologist, a chartered psychologist, a PhD, that there are additional safeguards to make sure what they are being told is appropriate and represents best knowledge. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Falco, one-man revolution. Final presentation is from Vivian.
Hi, I'm Vivian Swanson. I'm at the University of Stirling. I'm from England, but I work in Scotland and have lived and worked in Scotland for a long, long time. And I'm going to propose the Scottish independence model of health psychology. So, Scotland is a small country. Health psychology is a small profession. Scotland bases a lot of its independence on its values, its pride and its self-esteem. I think that's what we have as health psychologists. I'm very proud to be a health psychologist, and I think as a health psychologist I'm a bit different from other kinds of psychologists, and I would like to see us preserving that. So, independence for health psychology. I think it's important that we are different and that we know what our difference is, so that we can then compete in a market with other types of psychologists to help to improve the health of the nation. And I think if we let go of some of the things that make us different, then we don't have the power to compete. So I think that's maybe a bit controversial. So in terms, again, thinking about identity theory, I think it's important that other people know who we are, but I think it's also really important that we know who we are.
Thank you, Vivian, and thanks to all our panel members so far. Okay, I said hands. Where are the hands? Who wants to kick off? Margaret.
It's not really me. This is me being Claire. One of the comments that Claire and actually Sasha Kane raised, which ties into a bit of what Joe was saying, was that about the kind of job advertising in NHS in particular, and Sasha, in her previous role as a BPS national setter for the NHS, said that one of the problems that they were facing was that with head of departments, they feel that they can assume a lot about the competencies of clinical psychologists, and that they can't assume that that they had the same understanding from other applied psychologists, and that there was very much a kind of acknowledgement about it being easier to create roles for clinical psychology and make them badged as such, because then they don't actually then have to assess all the job competencies in the same way. And so Claire and Sasha were saying this is, quite a big hurdle, and they're not necessarily saying what the answers are, but I think it is something that from a future point of view, it's about really emphasising not just what our competencies are, but really thinking about what our competencies are, and where we should be focusing our attention in terms of moving forward, so that we can combat the fact that clinical psychology think they can just pick up our skills, and actually really emphasising that, but also then working with these individual heads of departments to make them realise it's not a barrier, actually it's an opportunity rather than something else.
That sounds great, Margaret, and thanks Claire and Sasha for your comments in advance. So I mean, it sounds to be the crux of that issue there is the idea that we aren't competent in lots of ways. So it's harder for people in the NHS to say, okay, health psychologists should do a particular role because we've got such different skills and we're not all trained the same. So there's a variability in our different types of competences we have. So who in the panel would like to pick up that? Is that a big issue that you see? Is there ways we can overcome it? Joe, do you want to come in?
So I agree, and I think that we've got to recognise that the NHS is under so much pressure, and additional work for people who are recruiting and thinking about what roles they need is a step too far sometimes, and they will go with comfort zone and what they know and what they're clear. And I wonder if there's something that we can be doing that it makes us clearer about what our competencies are, and a way of framing that differently. I don't know if that means different kind of training. There's certainly within the BPS there are moves, as some of you who were at the AGM previously will have heard, about applied psychology training routes, and that might help us in terms of the competencies that people have. In the meantime, I don't know if there's some clarity that we can provide of what templates of what competencies people might have that help people to apply for jobs, but also to help employers. I don't know if that's a realistic thing, but I think it's something we should be thinking about.
Vivian, would you like to come in as well?
I think that's really important. So I think one of the things we don't have is any kind of benchmarking of our competencies against what other people do. And I think there are two important things around competence. I think despite what I said about separateness, I think all psychologists should have a core set of competencies that make us psychologists. And then on top of that, we need in health psychology a clear set of competencies that make us health psychologists. So we need to be clear about what are the basic competencies that will make us employable if we want to work in the NHS context, for example, because we have those particular sets of skills. But then we also to think about what we can do that is not the same, that is different. And if we can define those by having a written set of competencies. And it's not so much, I know the BPS has competencies around stage 2, for example, but they're not framed in terms of what health psychologists do. They're framed more in terms of what they need to aspire to. So I think we need to be clear about setting down what we can actually do.
Okay. I mean, just to kind of try and spark some discussion in the room as well, picking up on those issues. I mean, is it not the case that many employers, particularly in the NHS, just don't take us seriously because they don't understand? So if that's the case, why don't we just abandon the title of health psychologist? Why don't we either go practitioner psychologist or applied psychologist? And we join together in a way where we have a shared competence, but I think employers might find it easier to understand. I've been devil's advocate mostly here. Is there any comments on that? Yeah, so here at the front.
I'm a PhD student and I'm nowhere as experienced as a lot of the people in this room, but as a health psychology, I guess, PhD student, because I did a master's, I think to abandon the name of health psychology, is kind of getting rid of what makes us unique. You know, I think health psychology it's about the prevention of ill health, promotion of good health. It's about helping people initially and essentially empowering them to manage and cope with long-term health conditions. And I think to abandon that title gets kind of those things that make us health psychologists, you're also abandoning them. So I think going back to what you said about maybe we need those core competencies beyond and above what the stage 2 provides. I think those things that I just mentioned are key for making us who we are. And I know I'm not very far in my career, but I've just fallen in love with health psychology, and I think as a student, it's not so easy to do a stage 2 training because of the expenses, basically, sure, unless you're doing a PhD alongside the stage 2, and that in itself is not very popular in the country. I think in Scotland, it's a bit more popular to want to do stage 2 if you want to do that. I think at the NHS, I'm not very sure, but I think the NHS provides some money or training, whereas here it's just so inaccessible, and I think there just needs to be a movement to not abandon that, to still keep pushing.
Sure. Yeah. They're really useful comments, actually. Vivian, do you want to just comment briefly on the Scottish model in terms of, which is obviously rather excellent in leading the way?
Yeah, I mean, it's small. So the Scottish model is to have funded places for stage 2 training, which have parity with clinical psychology training in terms of how much you're paid, etc. And they're NHS posts, so they're actually located in NHS areas, so that the trainees have the opportunity to work as an NHS employee to gain their stage 2 competencies. So it's a great model. Unfortunately, though, it still doesn't lead to employment of health psychologists in the NHS, because the point I made earlier about competencies, I think we still don't include as part of that training a standard set of competencies that are needed to work on a one-to-one basis in the NHS. So, but yeah, we're very lucky to have that model, and please apply, people who are interested.
And obviously we're all very grateful, Vivian, to the excellent work you've been doing over many years in Scotland in that regard. Comment over here, great. Over here, sorry.
Hi, I'd just like to contribute to the conversation as well. I'm a first-year PhD student, and I'm studying psychosocial approaches in early diagnostic research for cancer. And I wonder how that would leave me in my future career in reference to an identity. So, for example, I wouldn't be able to apply for stage 2 health psychology based on my MSc in psychological research methods, and how researchers like myself would move forward within the field.
I mean, everyone, I think, on the panel could probably respond in some way to that. I know, Lucy, you want to come in with something else. Anybody immediate comments back to that? I mean, your point is about being concerned that if we change something radically and you're going down a particular training route, my feeling would be that we would probably maintain all existing routes, but it's about trying to dovetail things in a way which are more meaningful, certainly in the NHS context. And what's really striking me about both the comments by Claire and Sasha and some of the other comments mentioned here is this idea that we are such a mixed bag in terms of what we offer, that makes it really difficult to sell ourselves in many ways. So, Mari, I'm going to bring in a second. Just Lucy's been trying to come in, and then I'll go to Mari.
Yeah, all I was going to say is, and it's relevant to your point actually, which is that the only point in using a title is if it conveys meaning, obviously. So there's something about that. And I did a little Twitter survey. It's very scientifically valid, obviously, with its 15 votes. But they're very important votes. And I asked people, how do you self-identify? And I gave them 3 categories: as a practitioner, as an academic or researcher, as both. The majority were as an academic or researcher. So I think that's really interesting, because straight away, when we started to discuss titles, we've gone straight to practitioners in the NHS. Actually, that isn't a lot of us. A lot of us are something else. And the other question that I asked, which is something that I'm interested in really, so the psychologist thing seems to convey treatment in some way, therapy or treatment in some way. And so I asked the question that if somebody who worked as a psychological therapist who had a good undergrad degree in psychology, would they be a psychologist? Not according to current UK rules. It's a bit about what Falco was saying about what makes you a psychologist. And 80% of my sample of 15 said no. So I think that's really interesting as well. So that we're kind of bound into protected titles in a way, which maybe limits us a bit, but also is there room for sort of psychologist or practitioner psychologist and psychological scientist, something that conveys a bit more meaning about where we see ourselves and how other people see us.
Excellent points. Lucy, I think we'll come back to some of those broader points. Mara, you wanted to come in?
Yes, I wanted to make one comment about competency. I think we're in a transitional state on the competency because we haven't had the competency training framework for very long. And all of us who grandparented in don't have the competencies by that criterion, so that just by the structure of who we are, there is confusion. But I think if we talk about the people who have been subsequently trained, I think that the people will begin to understand that we have those competencies. My second point is, I'm Queen Splitter. I was the person who did the initiation of health psychology in the UK. And if we hadn't achieved that, I'm telling you, I would not be calling myself a psychologist now. I wouldn't be going near a psychology conference. I found them boring, alienating. I had no friends. I had nobody to speak to. It's not about a name. It's about collecting friends and people who want to research things in the way that you want to do it and who want to apply things in the way you want to do it. So I would still fundamentally think there is value. And I also think in an identity as health psychology, we have promoted the science of our discipline quite independent or on top of what psychology had to contribute. I think we've done something quite useful there. I think we've also identified a whole lot of roles for psychologists that are really important, and in terms of the current health agenda, we might just miss them if we don't stick with some kind of title that identifies us as being relevant to those things. I've forgotten what my third point was going to be. I'm probably better hand this over now.
Okay, great, Mary. Thanks for those comments. And Chris, you wanted to come in as well, and then Hannah. Yeah.
Thank you. I'd like to start by violently agreeing with everything that everybody's said so far. I'm a social psychologist in recovery. And something that Mari said about the conference and the community of health psychologists made me remember why I stopped going to the social psychology conference, which became boring because it became entrenched with the quantitative people on one side and the qualitative people on the other side, and it just became tedious. I think the thing about this conference and any sort of health psychologist that you meet is this openness to other kinds of methods. So we had a great session before on N of 1, there's lots of qualitative stuff, there's stuff about, experimental stuff, there's all kinds of things. And so reflecting that's, I think, really useful. I personally use a different descriptor depending on who I'm talking to. And I think what's perhaps been missing so far is, what's the target audience? Is it an employer? Is it a government agency? Or is it a fellow psychologist? And so I sort of flit between different titles. So for example, some might know this already, but with Sheffield Hallam University, the University of Manchester has set up a behavioural science consortium. Very briefly, what it means is that we're in competition with other organisations that label themselves as providing behavioural science type services. And those companies are Ipsos Mori, McKinsey, and we're the only HEI providers. What it gives us is access to government funding to do impactful research. So for those purposes, being a behavioural scientist is important, but in order to distinguish ourselves in this competitive market, and this is a free market kind of thing, I think it's very important for us to say we're health psychologists, and what we do is we do science. We report it openly. We publish in peer-reviewed journals, and that's what sets us apart from McKinsey, the behavioural insights team, and that's sort of our unique selling point. So I think flexibility in titles and telling people what we can do. So I think Joe had the answer to kind of Ronan and Lucy's problem, which is if you're worried about your title, just tell people what it is that you do.
Sure. The really useful points, Chris, actually, and it's nice to get that balance, which is the idea that, because most of the conversation so far has been about when we're speaking to the NHS, for example. Hannah wants to come in, and then Angel's going to come in afterwards. And sorry, I don't know if you'll come in next. Yeah, great.
Hi, I'm Hannah Dale. I think what strikes me is just the breadth of health psychology, and I think that's what makes us such an interesting profession, and I think there's a real strength there. But I think going back to earlier points, particularly about employability, that is one of our main difficulties. And although the new stage 2 competencies are more specific and we can give more guidance, we don't have the benchmarking that Vivian has highlighted. And even with the revised competencies, you'll get some trainees that have worked with 1 or 2 patients, and you'll get some trainees that have worked with 50. And the trainees who've worked with 50 patients will be a lot more attractive to NHS employers. But there's not that consistency there, and I do think that's a major problem. I think also, and I think Joe maybe mentioned this, I think we could be creating job descriptions for HR departments in the NHS to use, because people don't have the time or motivation to create job descriptions that are competency-based. I think we could be doing that work so that it's a lot easier for people to advertise the jobs in the way that the BPS has advised.
Excellent. Really useful suggestions there, Hannah. Angel, do you want to come in, given that your organisation has recently changed their name? Who knew?
Thanks.
Lots of people. It was on Twitter.
So I'm a health psychologist. I have health psychologist at the end of my title for my email. And I did my training at the time when the grandparenting was just closing. So I went through stage 1, stage 2, and I identify myself very much in health psychology, very similar to what you were saying. I think we have an identity there, particularly if you followed that route. I work quite heavily with public health, and they're really interested in health psychology and what we do, our tools, our techniques, our approaches, things that they don't get in their training. And due to that, we set up the Health Psychology and Public Health Network in 2013 that was supposed to just be regional for a couple of local authorities who were interested. And it became national because many other local authorities were really interested in what health psychology was and what it could offer. But over the last probably year, we've done some webinars with PHE and the Association for the Directors of Public Health to explain what health psychology is. And they understand behavioural science language more than they understand health psychology. So with that in mind, we have rebranded to become the Behavioural Science and Public Health Network, just so that we can still get health psychology in when their ears are open rather than closing them off. However, I don't think that we should lose health psychology as a term. I think that if we do, like Chris says, we will lose our strength in our identity, our breadth, our ability to put psychology into different areas of health, whether it's prevention or treatment, policy, practice. I think what we need to do more of is actually to promote what we are and find ways of highlighting to people who don't know what health psychology is, what it is. And I think rather than having a conversation about changing a name, we should have a conversation about how we can make that name more widely known.
Excellent. Thanks. Very, very helpful comments, Angel, indeed. Sorry, your name. Can you say your name when you get the mic?
I just wanted to say I'm a trainee research practitioner, health psychologist. I know that's a mouthful, but I just wanted to say that as someone who's a bit involved in academia, but training to be an applied health psychologist, I'd add that voice. And I've been working in a context where in a social care context, where there's a vacuum, and gradually have been able to, I've always used the title trainee health psychologist in all my emails for the last 3 years, explain to people what I do, and gradually been earning that respect for, exactly my role within the organisation and what I've been able to provide to service users, to staff over time. I've won a lot of respect for it. But I think sometimes, someone who's working somewhere in a vacuum is a little bit easier than, say, working in the NHS where they have their preconceptions. But that doesn't mean it's not useful. But on the other hand, the other thing I've found really useful is involving students in my work. So actively recruiting students in psychology and people who are interested in my work. And then they always seem to come away with an understanding of what I do. And they say, oh, I never really understood what health psychology was. But having worked with you and been involved in what you do, I have an appreciation for it. So I think, of course, we need to have the top-down understanding of what we do, but we also have that room for like a bottom-up understanding of what we do as well for people who are going to end up working in those other roles in mental health nursing or in other parts of psychology. So there's more than one way to do it, to tackle that issue.
No, I think that's, again, very helpful. I mean, what it seems to me, kind of trying to summarize as we go along, I'm hearing a kind of chameleon type approach, which is we have to change what we look like in certain contexts. But it sounds to me that no one really wants to change our name or to forget who we are. I mean, the other interesting thing, when we did a structural review over the last number of years in the British Psychological Society, and everyone was surveyed about, the idea, why don't we get rid of the divisions? Why don't we get rid of the subsections? And guess what? No one did. The overwhelming response was, we want to remain as a health psychologist, as a social psychologist, etc., etc. I'm going to return to the panel now, because I know a number of people want to come in. Ronan wants to come in, and then Falco. So Ronan, do you want to go first?
Just a quick point in relation to what Chris had mentioned. My initial point was really in relation to health psychologists getting jobs in the NHS. And I may be naive, but I thought one possibility would be if jobs were advertised as applied psychologist, you might be more likely to get more people getting employed, and you could be applied psychologist brackets health, applied psychologist brackets clinical, but if you have the competencies that are specific to the job, you might get more health psychologists employed in the NHS. It's certainly not at all talking about getting rid of health psychology. And one other thing that really struck me from a research point of view was a few years ago being on the program board for NIHR, and these were these big program grants getting evaluated, and every program grant that came to get evaluated had 3 people speaking to it, plus a statistician, a behavioural economist, a qualitative researcher, and a health psychologist. And I thought that was remarkable, that if all the disciplines that you could be for an NHS-related research program, health psychology was one of the 4 that had to speak to every program grant. And that's a testimony to the health psychologists, such as Mary, Susan, Teresa, etc., who built that up to be recognised as an essential assessor for all NIHR program grants. And I think that really reflects the strength and the importance of health psychology and how it's recognised.
Excellent, Ronan, thanks for that. Falco, and then we'll go back to the audience, okay? Falco.
Just a reflection from my role as a chair of the public health panel of the Norwegian Research Council. So Norway is a really rich country, and if they see a problem, they develop a solution. They ask the question, who is the most qualified person to deliver the solution? They employ these people, and they change the health services. I think we have adopted here a narrative of austerity, and I think it's an important point to reflect on. If we have an effective psychological intervention, the first question is this going to be delivered by lay people, by nurses, or by a computer? We almost rule out the possibility that it's delivered by people from our own profession. And so we have a clear mapping of what we think the competencies of health psychologists are, but we don't have a very strong evidence base showing that if you deliver them with this level of competency, you get a better return. And in some ways, it is really, if you look through our own work, the number of psychological studies that quite immediately move to delivery through non-psychologists is quite stunning. So what would be helpful for us is if we could show that the evidence suggests that people delivering with certain skills have better cost effectiveness for a service delivery than having it delivered by other people. It would be a really strong step forward. And I can think of a dozen of studies where early pilot work delivered by psychologists suggests that the intervention is highly beneficial, and then it was rolled out by people who were reluctant to deliver, who were, had quite a long path towards trying to adopt certain basic psychological principles, and where the evidence suggests that fidelity has been catastrophic. And we do this over and over again. So if we want to help ourselves, it would be really useful to build this into trials and kind of say, I appreciate that Mari and Diane Dixon have some years ago developed a competency skill net mapping for the Scottish government, but what's really lacking at this stage is the evidence showing deliver this with a health psychologist and you get better cost effectiveness or not, depending on the challenge and the intervention, than if you have it delivered by a lay person. And I think that's a really important point where, as a community, we need to create better evidence to actually suggest to people that employing these competencies is worthwhile.
Excellent points, Falco, and there's lots of things in that. We'll unpick it afterwards. Do you want to say your name, please?
I'm Tishna Vandrivala. I trained quite a few years ago, and for many years could not call myself a health psychologist. For training, my undergraduate was in India. And interestingly, that didn't stop me getting a job as a health psychologist. I worked for many years in consultancy, and health psychology was in my title. And the point I'm trying to make is that we need to stop thinking about health psychology within the NHS context. There are various other contexts, and I'm delighted to know that there's a movement in local authorities and Public Health England to really think about it, but we're missing consultancy, we're missing employers. A lot of what we do is behavioral change. We look at stress interventions, we look at mindfulness, there's positive psychology, there is so much we can do. And instead of trying to compete with clinical psychology, I think we need to think beyond, because the skills we bring are way beyond on changing people's behaviors, and I think that may be the way forward. And I'm delighted, Rowan, with your comment about NIHR, that health psychology is as respected as other key members, PPI, statisticians and health economists. So that's really, I'm delighted to hear that. Thank you.
Excellent. Again, very insightful comments indeed. Mary, you want to come back, and then is it Rebecca at the back? So Mary, and then at the back. Or maybe we're going Rebecca first. If she's just there, so.
Thank you. Thanks, Darryl. I became a chartered health psychologist back when that term was used, almost 20 years ago. Before there was stage 1, before there was stage 2, and I know there are people in the room who were also chartered health psychologists at that time. And we were having exactly the same conversations then as we're having now. The NHS don't recognise what health psychologists are. There aren't jobs out there. And it makes me wonder why, after almost 20 years, we're having the same sorts of conversations and the same problems in trying to get the NHS to understand who we are. Now, we do a lot more than just working within the NHS, as has just been said. But most psychology departments within universities don't have a problem understanding what health psychology is. So the problem is within the NHS, and I think that part of that might be down to how we are training our students. So a lot of the training happens within the universities. It doesn't happen within placements within the NHS. And until we can get more of our students into NHS placements, working with patients, so that they actually have the confidence at the end of their training to know what it is they're doing, what they can provide, what competencies they actually have, and can stand up and say, I can do this because I've had all this training, then without that, we're still going to have this problem in another 10, 20 years. And I know it's really difficult to get those placements, and it's really difficult to get our students into those roles, and into public health roles, and into consultancy roles, but until we do that, people are still not going to really understand who we are and what we can offer.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that, Rebecca. Mary, and then yourself again. 1 second. Just giving you a time check. We've about another 10 minutes or so, so get your final questions in your head.
I don't think the problems are the same as they were 20 years ago. I think there are some problems that are the same, and we need to separate out the things that are okay, like the things that Ronan has spoken about, that I think are doing all right, and I think the way that our science is going ahead, I think is more or less all right. And there are lots of things that are going quite well, and so we shouldn't sink the whole ship just because half of it's going down. Sorry, that analogy doesn't really work.
Yeah. There's no ship going down anywhere.
I wanted to come back to the issue of, on the one hand, we've got the research psychologists. On the other hand, practitioner is the wrong word. Practitioner is too narrow for the kind of roles we have, even within the NHS. So that the people in the NHS that I have supervised have not taken practitioner roles. They've been people who have trained other people. They've conducted the research that's required within the NHS. They've done a whole lot of other things. And a practitioner seems to have this implication of working with patients. So I don't know what practitioner means. So maybe Lucy is or isn't a practitioner, I don't know. I think we should be calling ourselves applied psychologists in that context, probably. And that makes it much broader and makes us align also with the other disciplines like occupational psychology. And that brings me back to where we come to in training. Here's another kind of model that I think could work really well. When people have a psychology degree, if they want to go on to do a research degree, they do an MRes. I think we could be developing a way in which when someone has a psychology degree and they want to work as an applied psychologist, they have to do an M applied psychology. And after that, they can begin to say whether they want to be a health psychologist, an occupational psychologist, a clinical psychologist, or whatever. My guess is that the clinicals are far too far on for that. But my guess is that the other psychologists would be there with us. And in that M applied psychology, there's lots of basic stuff, like the kind of research tools that you need that are absolutely irrelevant if you're going to be a research psychologist within the discipline of psychology, because their job is to advance the discipline. The applied psychologist is to advance the use of the discipline. And I think these are different targets with different titles, and I think they should have different training. And I think that for a long time I've thought that there's so much in common with forensic, occupational, counselling psychologists and what they need to do. They've got to be able to measure behaviour, they've got to be able to explain behaviour, they've got to be able to change behaviour. The methods and the theories are the same. Why don't we do something about it?
Okay, interesting. Innovative idea. Have you had a question? Yeah, still?
Just going back to training from a student's point of view, you were talking about opportunities for students. I thought as a student, I can't call myself, as a student who's done stage 1, and I'm currently doing, I'm in my first year of doing a health psychology related PhD, I can't call myself a provisional health psychologist, whereas I know other PhD students might perhaps, if they're specializing in sports psychology, for example, or some other form of psychology, they might be able to say, actually, I'm a provisional sports psychologist and I can take on clients, and then I've got a supervision, so I can always feedback and I'm supervised. But I feel like as a health psychologist, the opportunity for me to say I'm a provisional health psychologist and actually I want to be active, I want to get out there, I want to do something, even if it's once a week, to go and, I mean, it doesn't stop me from doing that anyway, but I think if that was there, it would make me a bit more, I guess, I don't like using this word, but credible, and then would actually promote and promote health psychology, like what it was said, you know, promotion is really key right now, especially if you're coming up to, you know, being a health psychologist.
Absolutely, that's great, thank you. So I'm going to say a couple of words and then I'm going to invite the panel just to say a couple of final words. I mean, picking up on Rebecca's point, which I will now disagree with entirely, and which reflects Mari's point, I think I'm an optimist, and you look at this, our discipline, and what we've achieved over the last 25 years is actually extraordinary. The number of people who work in our field, okay, fair enough, there's a huge bias in the more researched, applied, non-NHS positions. But it's remarkable. The work that's happened in Scotland, and we do to give credit entirely to Vivian, is also extraordinary, and Mary and others, and Diane and others in those universities. Ronan as well, I'm sure you helped somehow. I didn't want you to feel left out. But it is remarkable. If you look at the journals that we've published, okay, so go back to the science, it's amazing. You know, Health Psychology Review, which is a leading journal in our field, is one of the biggest journals in the world, not just in psychology. So, and our own journals and the science has improved. We know there's some issues in terms of replication, etc. But we as psychologists, health psychologists, have led the way. We were the people who were registering protocols in advance. We were the people who were registering our RCTs in advance. We were the ones who were using a range of methodologies, the methodology in order to answer the research question, and not just any methodology. So I think I completely agree that we have lots and lots to celebrate about, but there is still this remaining problem, which is linked to, I think, primarily to how we sell ourselves to the NHS. And there is confusion there, but these things have got better. I think it's a grassroots sort of approach that we need. I've said this before, in terms of we need this bottom-up approach. We need individuals in this room to go and speak to their local context in NHS organisations at all levels of care, from primary right through to tertiary. That's how we'll make a difference. And we use the same terminology, which is we are health psychologists. And we have different competencies. But if we start with the health psychology as the tag and the title and the label, before not too long, I think we will make a difference. And I don't buy it. I think many people who work in the NHS do know what a health psychologist does, or at least in their context. If it's in a heart hospital, they know what that happens. If it's in primary care and smoking cessation, they know what that involves. So, I mean, let's try and be optimistic, but there's more work to be done. I mean, a lot more work. So, final comments then from our panel. Lucy.
Okay, I've got two final comments. One, and they're both about training actually, and one is that if Mary starts an M, Applied Psychology, I'm your first person, I'll come on it, because when we were grandparented in, so I did a master's and a PhD, I didn't have any skills to even talk to another person about anything. No, about what psychologists were, about what we did, about the selling it, and actually the selling it and the making decisions. I think making decisions is a really key thing. So we're asked all the time in our global health work, what should we do? We need to do this thing, what should we do? Now, nothing in my training told me to tell anyone else what to do ever, whereas other health professionals do have that within their training. So I'm on your course, Mary, sign me up. And the second one is that if we want to address the issue of more employment, we need to address the issue of funding for training. And we're probably going around that the wrong way. And why aren't we getting on, why aren't we getting employers to use the apprenticeship levy to do trailblazer apprenticeships for psychology of any form, and particularly of health psychology within the NHS. And if we stick with the HEI model that we've currently got, we've got a big problem with widening participation, and we've got a big problem with funding. So they're my...
Thanks for that, Lucy. Ronan.
Just briefly, I agree with Mary's point that having some shared training for applied psychologists, I think would be the way forward. I think it would stop divisions. It would get more collective starting to training, and then people specialise off afterwards. And I still think that in the NHS it might free up more jobs for health psychologists if the jobs are advertised as applied psychologists brackets health.
Thanks, Ronan. Joe.
Yeah, it's made me think about the multiplicity of our roles, that we do many things, that divide of researcher and practitioner, we've said, isn't particularly helpful. I agree the term practitioner is problematic, but I reflect on how many of us probably are researchers, practitioners, educators and consultants, and I'm not sure that we frame all of that well. I'm not sure the DHP represents all of those things well, and particularly somebody raised the point about the consultancy private sector, and I think we have much more impact that we could have if we're clearer about what health psychology could bring in all of those different ways. And I wanted to say thank you on behalf of the DHP, because I think that this has been an incredibly important discussion for us in kick-starting some of these issues and helping us to think how we'll go forward. We'll need all of your help, and everybody else who's not here, to think about how we can really drive some change and make people aware of how good we are. So thank you very much, everyone.
Excellent. Thank you, Joe. Falco.
Thinking about the idea of applied psychology also helps to solve the problem beyond the division of health psychology. So the markets are changing very rapidly. At the moment, there's a significant need for behavior change expertise. And that, again, isn't only nested within health psychology. And so there'll be needs for different types of competence mix in the futures. And the best way really is to think this through from the BPS perspective rather than from the division. And take the example of environmental psychology, where very similar approaches are being used, but outside of the health area. And I think the overlap between different training modules and competencies is best thought of, as a modular approach within the BPS, so that people can, in the future, mix as the job market and the opportunities develop, and that would probably be quite helpful in future-proofing the professions of people.
Great, thanks for that. And final comments then from Vivian.
Thank you. So I think just picking up on the comment about timing, I think 20, 25 years ago things were different. I think timing at the moment is really good for health psychology. So if you look at the way that things are developing in the National Health Service, but also in other aspects like health and social care, for example, in the third sector, what people are interested in at the moment is prevention. It's how we can promote health and well-being for people, and that's what we do. So we have to make it clear to people that we have a role here, that we can actually help with the problems that are facing society at the moment. To do that, we need to have a bit of self-efficacy. So we need to think about our own confidence in who we are and what we do. And I think it's important that, therefore, as I said at the start, we know who we are and we know what we can do. And I think we need to get together to make sure that that is clear to all of us and to people who might want to employ us. And I think my last point is that we need champions. And when we did get the programme together in Scotland, what we had was some people who were very sold on health psychology, who helped us to move the program, the training program forward. I think Angel will probably tell you the same thing in relation to public health. What you need is people who believe and who will champion and who will help us. So I'm going to be a bit evangelical and say, can we all think about people who we might know who can help us, who will champion what we do, and help us to actually be able to deliver health psychology. I suppose the last point is we need money. That's slightly more difficult. Maybe, like Mary said, we should have a whip round. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Before we finish, actually, I'd like to extend our thanks to Margaret Husted. Margaret ultimately made this happen today and other people on the committee, but thank you, Margaret, for chasing people up and our various discussions about it, so thank you very much. Okay, so thank you. The final thing is the panel have done a great job. Well, they've been okay, to be fair. But the audience were better. So thanks, guys, for all your contributions. And also, there's many issues we've raised here today. And just to echo Vivian's point and others, and my own point is that this grassroots thing is important, that kind of where individuals matter. And that's what will make the difference. So thank you all, and I will probably see some of you in about 45 minutes' time.